About that time, cooked rations were brought up. Before the distribution, however, was finished, Archer's and McGowan's brigades were moved forward, from their retired positions as the right flank to straighten the line. They soon came upon a picket line of the enemy, and sharp firing began. Stuart, without waiting further, ordered the whole line to the attack. Archer's brigade, about 1,400 strong, in advancing through the pine thickets, trended to the right and gradually opened a gap between it and McGowan's brigade, emerging from the forest alone and in front of the enemy's rear guard. A sharp action ensued, while Archer extended his right and threatened the enemy's rear, forcing the battery to retreat. He then charged and captured 100 prisoners and forced the abandonment of 4 of the guns. He attempted to push his advance much farther, but was checked by the fire of the enemy's artillery and of the rear brigade, Graham's, of Sickles's column. After 2 efforts, realizing that his force was too small, and leaving one of his captured guns, he fell back to Hazel Grove Ridge about 6:30 a.m. This was now being occupied rapidly by our guns. Thus, so easily that we did not at once realize its great value, we gained space for our batteries, where we soon found that we could enfilade the enemy's adjacent lines. Meanwhile, the first assault had been made along the whole line by Hill's division. The enemy's advanced line crossed the plank road and was held by Williams's division of the 12th Corps, Berry's of the 3D Corps, and Hayes's brigade of the 2D Corps. In rear of the front line was a second line near the edge of the forest. Across the small stream and along the edge of the elevated plateau, their artillery had been strongly entrenched during the night, making a third line. The 2 divisions from Hazel Grove, with their 4 batteries, were brought up in rear of the forces already holding the front to the west. This whole front from north to south was scarcely 1.25 miles long. It was defended by about 25,000 men, and it was being attacked by about an equal number. The Confederates, however, had the hot end of the affair, in having to take the aggressive and advance upon breastworks protected by a battis and entrenched guns. In his first assault, however, Hill's division, now commanded by Heth, after a terrific exchange of musketry, succeeded in driving the Federals from the whole of their front line. They followed the retreating enemy and attacked the second line, where the resistance became more strenuous. On the extreme right, Archer's brigade had now fallen back to Hazel Grove, where it remained, supporting the guns now taking position there. This left McGowan's flank uncovered, and a Federal force attacked it and drove it back to the captured line. This uncovered Lane's brigade, and it was also forced to fall back. On the left of the plank road, the advance of Thomas beyond the enemy's first line met both a stronger second line and a flank attack, his left being in the air. After an hour's hard fighting, the whole line was forced back to the captured breastworks, with severe losses. It was clear that extreme efforts would be needed to drive the enemy from his position. Stuart ordered 30 additional guns to Hazel Grove and brought forward both the second and third lines, putting in at once his last reserves. It would be useless to follow in detail the desperate fighting which now ensued and was kept up for some hours. The Federal guns on the Fairview Heights were able to fire over the heads of 2 lines of infantry, and other batteries aided from the new position in which Hooker had now established the 1st, Sud and 5th Corps. This was so near on our left that Carroll's and McGregor's brigades of the 2d Corps with artillery were sent forward to attack our flank, and were only repulsed after such fighting that they lost 367 men. With the aid of our second and third lines, fresh assaults were made on both sides of the plank road, and now the enemy's second lines were carried. But his reserves were called upon, and again our lines were driven back, and countercharges south of the road again penetrated the gap between McGowan and Archer. Paxton's brigade was brought across from the north and restored the situation at a critical moment, Paxton, however, being killed. Some of our brigades were now nearly fought out, the 3 divisions being often massed in one, and the men could only be moved by much example on the part of their officers. Stuart himself was conspicuous in this, and was everywhere encouraging the troops with his magnetic presence and bearing, and singing as he rode along the lines, "Old Joe Hooker, won't you come out the wilderness?" There can be no doubt that his personal conduct had great influence in sustaining the courage of the men, so that when at last our artillery had begun to shake the Federals' lines, there was still the spirit to traverse the bloody ground for the fourth time and storm the Fairview batteries. Guns had been brought to Hazel Grove from all the battalions on the field: Pegram's, Carter's, Jones's, Mackintosh's and Alexander's. Perhaps 50 guns in all were employed here, but less than 40 at any one time, as guns were occasionally relieved or sent to the rear to refill. Their field of fire was extensive, being an oblique on both the enemy's artillery and infantry. Some ground having been gained on the plank road, Coles. Jones and Carter had also been able to establish 10 rifle guns there, which enfiladed the plank road as far as the Chancellorsville house. About 9 o'clock, the Federal artillery fire was perceptibly diminished. Many of their guns were running short of ammunition, and fresh ammunition was not supplied. Sickles asked for it and for reinforcements, but none were sent. It would seem that Hooker preferred to lose the Chancellorsville plateau entirely and fall back into his new position, which was like a citadel close at hand, rather than risk fighting outside of it. At Stuart's last charge, the Federal lines yielded with but moderate resistance. The guns in the Fairview entrenchments abandoned them and fell back to the vicinity of the Chancellorsville house. The guns at Hazel Grove moved forward across the valley and occupied the deserted Federal positions, here making connection with Anderson's division, which Lee was extending to his left to meet them. They were soon joined by Jordan's battery of my own battalion, which had been serving with Anderson. The enemy, driven out of their fortified lines, attempted to make a stand near the Chancellorsville house, but it was a brief one. There were no breastworks here to give shelter, and their position was now so contracted that our guns from 3 directions crossed their fire upon it. Hooker, in the porch of the Chancellorsville house, was put hors de combat for 2 or 3 hours by a piece of brick torn from a pillar by a cannon shot. No one took command in his place, and for a while the army was without a head. Meanwhile, McLaws and Anderson had seen the enemy withdrawing from their fronts and pressed forward at the same time that Stuart's infantry crowned the plateau from the west. Some prisoners were cut off and captured on each flank, and a few guns also fell into our hands, but as a whole, the enemy's withdrawal was orderly and well managed, and with less loss than might have been expected. One sad feature of the occasion was that the woods on the north of the road were set on fire by shells, and the dry leaves spread the fire rapidly, although the trees and undergrowth did not burn. Efforts were made to remove the wounded, but the rapid spread of the fire prevented, and some of the wounded of both armies were burned. About 10 a.m., Lee, advancing with McLaws's division, met Stuart with Jackson's corps near the site of the Chancellorsville house, now only a smoking ruin, for our shells had set it on fire. It was, doubtless, a proud moment to Lee, as it was to the troops who greeted him with enthusiastic cheering. Lee by no means intended the battle to end here. Both infantry and artillery were ordered to replenish ammunition and renew the assault, but there came news from the rear, which forced a change of programme. Sedgwick's corps had broken through the flimsy line in front of it and was now moving up the plank road. With all his audacity, Lee could not venture to attack 5 corps entrenched in his front, while Sedgwick came up in his rear. The story of events at Chancellorsville must now pause, as the action there paused, while that is told of Sedgwick's venture against Lee's rear. Hooker had sent urgent orders the night before to Sedgwick to come to his help, and a staff officer, Warren, to supervise their execution. But Sedgwick, though already on the south side of the river, which Hooker did not seem to know, was 3 miles below Fredericksburg, near the scene of Franklin's crossing in December. He had been under orders to advance toward Richmond on the Bowling Green Road, and had disposed his troops accordingly. To advance up the plank road, it was necessary to march to Fredericksburg and force the Confederate lines on Mary's Hill. These lines were held from Taylor's Hill to the Howison House, about 3 miles, by only 2 brigades, Barksdale's and Hayes's, with a small amount of artillery. The regiments were strung out in single rank, the men sometimes yards apart, and with wide intervals at many places between regiments. On Mary's Hill, 2 regiments, the 18th and 21st Miss, with 6 guns of the Washington Artillery and 2 under Lieutenant Brown of Alexander's battalion, were distributed from the plank road to Hazel Creek, about a half-mile. Sedgwick had marched at midnight with a good moon, but his progress was slow, for the Confederate pickets annoyed it. By daylight he was in Fredericksburg, and his batteries from both banks of the river and from the edge of the town opened on the Confederates. Sedgwick had been informed by Hooker that the Confederate force left at Fredericksburg was very small, and without delay he sent forward 4 regiments from Wheaton's and Shaler's brigades to charge the works in front of Mary's Hill. It was sending a boy on a man's errand. The Confederate infantry reserved its fire until the enemy were within 40 yards, when they opened and quickly drove them back. A second assault was made, but with similar result. Sedgwick was now convinced that a heavy force confronted him, and he waited for Gibbon's division of the 2D Corps. This had just crossed from Falmouth, and it made an effort upon the extreme Confederate left. It proved futile on account of the canal along the front at that part of the field, which was defended by 3 regiments of Hayes's brigade of Early's division, hurried there by Early on seeing the enemy's preparations. Soon afterward, Wilcox's brigade came to the scene from Banks Ford, where it had been in observation on the 2nd. At dawn on the 3rd, Wilcox noted that the enemy's pickets on the north side were wearing haversacks, and correctly guessed that the forces opposite were leaving for Chancellorsville. He was preparing to march in the same direction when a messenger brought word of the advance of Gibbon's division. Thereupon, leaving a picket of 50 men and 2 guns in observation at Banks Ford, Wilcox marched to Taylor's Hill. About 10 a.m., Gibbon having reported that an attack on our extreme left was impracticable, and Howe's division, making no progress east of Hazel Run, Sedgwick had no recourse but to renew his attack upon Mary's Hill by main force. He accordingly prepared a much stronger assault than that of the morning. Newton's division, supported by Burnham's brigade, was to attack Mary's Hill, while Howe's division assaulted Lee's Hill beyond Hazel Run. This force numbered about 14,000 men, with an abundant artillery. Across Hazel Creek were 7 guns of Cutts and Cabell's battalions, and the 2 remaining regiments of Barksdale's brigade, and 1 Louisiana of Hayes's brigade. About 11 a.m., both Newton and Howe renewed the assault. Newton advanced rapidly through the fire of the few Confederate guns, but recoiled soon after the infantry opened, although Barksdale's line was so thin that it scarcely averaged a man to 5 feet of parapet. Some of the Federal regiments, however, suffered severely, and a number of killed and wounded were left near the Confederate line. This, by a strange piece of good nature on the part of one of our best officers, proved our undoing. When Newton's line was beaten back, the firing on both sides nearly ceased, and some Federal officer sent forward a flag of truce. No Federal report mentions this incident. The flag was probably sent by only a brigade commander, for the fighting by Howe's division across Hazel Run was kept up without cessation. Colon Griffin of the 18th Miss received the flag. The officer bearing it asked to be allowed to remove his dead and wounded in Griffin's front. Without referring to his brigade commander, Griffin granted the request, and, still more thoughtlessly, allowed his own men to show themselves while the wounded were being delivered. The enemy, to their great surprise, discovered what a small force was in their front. They lost little time in taking advantage of the information. The action was reopened, and now a charge was made with a rush, and the enemy swarmed over our works. The Mississippians had no chance to escape, but fought with butts of guns and bayonets, and were mostly captured, with the loss of about 100 killed and wounded. The casualties in Newton's division and Burnham's brigade in the whole battle were about 1,200, of which probably 900 fell in this affair. All of the guns on the hill were captured, Brown's section last of all, firing until surrounded. Meanwhile, Howe's division had a full mile to traverse before reaching the Confederate lines. Instead of a charge, their progress was a slow advance under cover of heavy artillery fire. Before they reached the Confederate line, Newton's division had made its second charge and was in possession of Mary's Hill. Thereupon, Early, who was in command, ordered the withdrawal of his whole division and the formation of a new line of battle across the Telegraph Road, about 2 miles in the rear. Here he concentrated Gordon's, Hoke's and Smith's brigades with the remnants of Barksdale's. Hayes's brigade had been cut off with Wilcox, and these 2 brigades were in position to delay Sedgwick in advancing upon the plank road toward Chancellorsville. But Hayes, under orders from Early, crossed the plank road before Sedgwick had made any advance. Wilcox then took position with 4 guns across the plank road and delayed the enemy's advance as much as possible, while he fell back slowly to Salem Church, where he had been notified that McLaws would meet him with reinforcements. He reached this point about 3 p.m., meeting there Wofford's, Semmes's, Kershaw's and Mahone's brigades under McLaws. The 5 brigades rapidly formed a single line of battle across the plank road. Wilcox's brigade held the centre, with the 14th and 11th Ayler, on the left of the plank road and the 10th and 8th on the right. The 9th Ayler was in reserve a short distance in rear of the 10th. 4 guns were posted across the plank road, and a company of infantry was put in Salem Church, and one in a schoolhouse a short distance in front. Kershaw's brigade was on the right of Wilcox, and Wofford on the right of Kershaw. Semmes's brigade was on Wilcox's left, and Mahone's brigade was on the left of Semmes. In front of the line of battle stretched a fringe of dense young wood, some 200 yards wide, and beyond that, for perhaps a half-mile, were open fields, which extended with a few interruptions on each side of the plank road back to Fredericksburg, about 4 miles. Sedgwick had been delayed over 4 hours in traversing that distance. About 4:30 p.m., Sedgwick established a battery 1,000 yards in front of Wilcox and opened fire. The Confederate artillery was nearly out of ammunition, and after a few rounds it was withdrawn. Encouraged by this, the Federals now sent forward Brooks's division, formed across the road in 2 lines, with Newton's division in the same formation upon Brooks's right. Now ensued one of the most brilliant and important of the minor affairs of the war. McLaws had reached the field and assumed the command, but credit is also due to Wilcox, who had delayed many times his number for several hours and gained time for reinforcements to arrive. The story of the battle may be told very briefly. North of the road, opposite the 14th and 11th Ayler, was Torbert's Jersey Brigade under Brown in a double line. On the south, opposite the 8th, 9th and 10th Ayler, was Bartlett's Brigade, one of the best in the Federal Army, which boasted that it had never been repulsed and had never failed to hold any position it was ordered to occupy. The strength of the Confederate position consisted in the thick undergrowth which completely hid their lines, lying down on the crest of a slight ridge in rear of the woods. These were held by skirmishers during the enemy's approach across the open. When the artillery was withdrawn, it left a gap of about 50 yards between the 11th Ayler, on the left of the road, and the 10th on the right. Bartlett's brigade advanced gallantly through the severe skirmish fire, fought through the strip of woods, drove the company from the church, and cut off the one in the schoolhouse. Pushing on and overlapping the left of the 10th Ayler, they enfiladed it, broke its line, and drove it back in confusion. The 8th Ayler, under Lieutenant Collers Herbert, on the right of the 10th, however, did not break, but threw back its 3 left companies, and brought an enfilade fire on the enemy's further advance. The 9th Ayler, being in reserve a little in rear of the 10th, rose from the ground, and giving the enemy a volley, charged them and drove them back. Brown's brigade, on the opposite side of the road, had a wider body of woods to cross, and had not advanced as far as Bartlett. But when Bartlett was driven back, Wilcox's whole brigade joined in the counterstroke. Bartlett's first line was followed so rapidly that the prisoners in the schoolhouse were liberated, and the rush of the fugitives and the quick pursuit overwhelmed the second line, giving it no chance to make a stand. Across the plank road, Semmis's two right regiments, the 10th and 51st Gade, joined the 14th and 11th Ayla, and these four regiments, meeting the Jersey Brigade in the woods, drove it back in such a direction that the fugitives from each side of the plank road converged upon the road. The Confederates in pursuit said that they had never had such crowds to fire upon. The pursuit was dangerously prolonged, but fortunately the enemy contented himself by checking it, and the Confederates then slowly withdrew. Long-range firing, however, was kept up until night. Bartlett's brigade reported a loss in this attack of 580 officers and men out of less than 1,500 men. Brown's brigade reported a loss of 511. Brooks, commanding the division, said in his official report, "In this brief but sanguinary conflict, this division lost nearly 1,500 officers and men. Col. H. W. Brown, commanding the Jersey Brigade, was severely wounded, and Col. Collet, 1st N.J., Col. G. W. Town, and Lut Col. Hall, 95th PA, were killed. Wilcox's brigade lost 75 killed, 372 wounded, and 48 missing, a total of 495. The losses of Semmes's brigade are included with the campaign losses. One of its regiments, however, the 10th Guyamet, reports for this day 21 killed, 102 wounded, and 5 missing, a total of 128 out of 230 present. In the morning at Chancellorsville, this regiment had received the surrender of the 27th Con, which had been on picket and was cut off by the capture of Chancellorsville. During this charge, it also captured over 100 prisoners. While this action was going on, Early had formed a line of battle to resist an advance of the enemy upon the Telegraph Road, and was bringing up his extreme right from Hamilton's Crossing. It was about night when his whole division was concentrated. The enemy was holding Gibbon's entire division idle in Fredericksburg, guarding the pontoon bridges to Falmouth. Had Gibbon moved up on Sedgwick's flank to Banks Ford, his division would have counted for something in the next day's affairs. His force was just what Sedgwick needed to enable him to hold his ground. Returning now to Chancellorsville, we have to note a movement which involved an unfortunate Confederate delay on the next day, a delay which enabled Sedgwick's corps to escape scot-free from a position which should have cost him all his artillery and half his men. The river road, from Chancellorsville to Fredericksburg via Banks Ford, was left unoccupied when Hooker took refuge in his fortified lines on the morning of the 3rd. Anderson, with his 3 remaining brigades, Wright's, Perry's and Posey's, was sent at 4 p.m. to watch that road and threaten the enemy upon that flank. 2 hours after sunrise on the 4th, Heth arrived with 3 brigades to relieve Anderson, who was now ordered to proceed to Salem Church, about 6 miles, and report to McLaws, which he did about noon. This sending Anderson to reinforce McLaws might have been done the afternoon before. He would then have been on hand at the earliest hour for the joint attack upon Sedgwick on the 4th, which is now to be described. The events of the morning of the 4th had been as follows. No communication had been received by Sedgwick from Hooker, and he was still under orders to come to Chancellorsville. But at an early hour, movements of Early's troops were discovered in his rear, and instead of advancing, Sedgwick had deployed Howe's division perpendicular to the plank road facing to his rear, and stretching to the river above Banks Ford, where pontoon bridges had been laid the afternoon before. Sedgwick's scouts had reported that a column of the enemy, 15,000 strong, coming from the direction of Richmond, had occupied the heights of Fredericksburg, cutting him off from the town. He at once abandoned all idea of taking the aggressive, and only wished himself safely across the river. But he did not dare to attempt a crossing, except under cover of night. His lines were too long and were weak in plan, as they faced in 3 directions, east, south, and west. But he dared not venture a change, for fear of precipitating an attack. When at last he received a dispatch from Hooker, its non-committal advice was not encouraging. It said, "Everything's snug here. We contracted the lines a little and repulsed the last assault with ease. General Hooker wishes them to attack him tomorrow, if they will. He does not desire you to attack them again in force, unless he attacks him at the same time. He says you are too far away for him to direct. Look well to the safety of your corps and keep up communication with General Benham at Banks Ford and Fredericksburg. You can go to either place if you think it best to cross. Banks Ford would bring you in supporting distance of the main body and would be better than falling back to Fredericksburg. A little later, Hooker sent another message, urging Sedgwick, if possible, to hold a position on the south bank, to which Sedgwick replied, "The enemy threatens me strongly on two fronts. My position is bad for such attack. It was assumed for attack, not for defence. It is not improbable that the bridges at Banks Ford may be sacrificed. Can you help me strongly if I am attacked?" No answer to this inquiry appears, and Sedgwick stood on the defensive, awaiting nightfall. Meanwhile, early in the morning, Early's division, with Barksdale's brigade, had moved down upon Mary's Hill, which they found held by a picket force only and easily occupied. An advance was attempted into Fredericksburg, but it was found with barricades across the streets held by one of Gibbon's brigades, supported by two other brigades and a number of guns on the north bank. Early then sent to communicate with McLaws and endeavour to arrange a joint attack upon Sedgwick, but received information that Anderson's division was coming and was himself sent for to meet Lee. Before leaving Chancellorsville that morning, Lee had examined Hooker's lines with the view of assaulting at once, but their strength made it imprudent to do so while Sedgwick was still south of the river, so he next set out to dispose of Sedgwick, that he might then concentrate his whole force to attack Hooker. Probably no man ever commanded an army, and, at the same time, so entirely commanded himself as Lee. This morning was almost the only occasion on which I ever saw him out of humour. It was when waiting the arrival of Anderson, with his 3 brigades from the River Road, after being relieved by Heth. Anderson was in no way to blame for the delay, but he should have been relieved the afternoon before, which would have let him move during the night. Some delay was inevitable, as Sedgwick's peculiar rectangular formation was not readily understood. It was about 3 miles in extent and occupied high ground, with a wide open valley in its front, forcing a development of our line of nearly 6 miles to cover its 3 fronts. An entire day would have been none too much to devote to the attack if the fruits of victory were to be reaped. Although Lee urged all possible speed, it was 6 p.m. when the advance commenced. Sunset was at 7. Darkness fell before the lines could be gotten into close action. In the dusk, 2 of Early's brigades, Hoke's and Hazel's, fired into each other by mistake and were thrown into confusion. Both had to be withdrawn and reformed. The enemy was, however, forced back to the vicinity of Banks Ford, and had there then been daylight to bring up our batteries, there might have been large captures. Upon McLaws's front, ranges were marked by daylight for firing upon Banks Ford, and some guns were kept firing all night. But all that was possible amounted only to annoyance. It was again illustrated that afternoon attacks seldom reap any fruits of victory. It was with great elation on the morning of the 5th that our guns fired the last shots across the Rappahannock at Sedgwick's retreating columns. But orders, soon received from headquarters, indicated that our commander was not yet satisfied. Early's division and Barksdale's brigade were directed to remain in observation at Banks Ford and Fredericksburg, which had also been evacuated by Gibbon's division during the previous night, while all the rest of the army was ordered to return to the front of Hooker's lines near Chancellorsville, which Lee intended to assault on the morrow with his whole force. What was known of the enemy's position gave assurance that the task would be the heaviest which we had ever undertaken. Hooker now had his entire army concentrated, and, allowing for his losses, must have had fully 90,000 men to defend about 5 miles of breastworks. These he had had 48 hours to prepare, with all the advantages for defence which the wilderness offered. Lee would scarcely be able to bring into action 35,000 under all the disadvantages imposed by the wilderness upon the offensive, and by 2 streams which on the southeast and northwest covered 3/4 of the enemy's front. Behind these streams both flanks rested securely upon the river. The attack would have to be made everywhere squarely in front, and our artillery would be unable to render any efficient help. When, upon the 6th, we found the lines deserted and the enemy gone, our engineers were amazed at the strength and completeness of the enemy's entrenchments. Impenetrable abatis covered the entire front, and the crest everywhere carried headlogs under which the men could fire as through loopholes. In rear, separate structures were provided for officers, with protected outlooks, whence they could see and direct without exposure. 4 of Hooker's corps had suffered casualties averaging 20%, but 3, the 1st, 2d and 5th, had scarcely been engaged. It must be conceded that Lee never in his life took a more audacious resolve than when he determined to assault Hooker's entrenchments, and it is the highest possible compliment to the army commanded by Lee to say that there were 2 persons concerned who believed that, in spite of all the odds, it would have been victorious. These 2 persons were Gens, Lee and Hooker. For Hooker was already hurrying his preparations to retreat during the coming night. Clearly, this decision was the mistake of his life. During the afternoon of the 5th, there came on one of the remarkable storms which on many occasions closely followed severe engagements. The rainfall was unusually heavy and continued long after dark, converting roads into quagmires, rivulets into torrents, and causing great discomfort to man and beast. But its occurrence was advantageous to the Confederates, as it prevented their pressing upon the enemy's impregnable line, and it hurried the efforts of the Federals to cross the river, as rapidly rising waters overflowed the approaches to their bridges. Before the rain, I had found positions for several guns close upon the riverbank, partly around a bend below the Federal left, giving an oblique fire upon some of their batteries. During the night we constructed pits, and, at early dawn, were putting the guns in them, when we were suddenly fired upon by guns square upon our own flank and across the river. A lieutenant had his ankle smashed, some horses were killed, and some dismounted limber chests were exploded, before all could be gotten under cover in the pits. From these we could make no reply, as they faced Hooker's lines, and we could only lie close and wait for more daylight. This revealed that the enemy had abandoned his works during the night and recrossed the river. To retaliate, I brought up 7 other guns, under cover of a wood, and engaged the enemy for a half-hour, inflicting some loss in killed and wounded, as reported by Gen. Hunt, with no further loss to ourselves, but the wheel of a gun. Finding by then that the battle was over and no enemy left on our side of the river, the guns were gradually withdrawn and camps were sought in another severe rainstorm, which came up about 5 p.m. and lasted far into the night. The battle made by Stuart on the 3D has rarely been surpassed, measured either by the strength of the lines carried or by the casualties suffered in so brief a period. In Colston's division, 4 brigades lost 8 brigade commanders, 3 killed and 5 disabled. 3 out of 6 of the division staff fell. In Pender's brigade of Heth's division, 6 out of 10 field officers were killed or wounded. Our brigades rarely came to the field 2,000 strong, and casualties of 600 to a brigade were rarely reached even in battles prolonged over a day. Here, within 6 hours, 5 of the 15 brigades lost over 600 in killed and wounded each. Lane's NC brigade losing 786, Colston's NC and Vater losing 726, Pender's NC 693. The Battle of Chickamauga is generally called the bloodiest of modern battles. The losses given by Livermore are 22% in the Federal Army and 25% in the Confederate in 2 days' fighting. Jackson's 3 divisions had a paper strength of 26,661, and their losses were 7,158, about 27%. They were, doubtless, over 30% of the force actually engaged. The losses in the 3D and 12th Federal Corps, which composed the principal part of our opponents, were less, as they fought behind breastworks. Their strength on paper was 32,171. Their losses were 4,703, being about 15% of the paper strength and probably 18% of the actual. Had Gen. Lee been present on the left during the Sunday morning attack, and seen Stuart's energy and efficiency in handling his reserves, inspiring the men by his contagious spirit and in the cooperation of artillery with the infantry, he might have rewarded Stuart on the spot by promoting him to the now vacant command of Jackson's corps. Ewell, who did succeed Jackson, was always loved and admired, but he was not always equal to his opportunities, as we shall see at Gettysburg. Stuart's qualities were just what were needed, for he was young, he was not maimed, and he had boldness, persistence, and magnetism in very high degree. Lee once said that he would have won Gettysburg had he had Jackson with him. Who so worthy to succeed Jackson as the man who had successfully replaced him on his last and greatest field? Chapter 16. Gettysburg, the first day. A pause of 4 weeks after the Battle of Chancellorsville to prepare for an aggressive counterstroke was, perhaps, the period of highest tide in Confederate hopes among all the vicissitudes of the war. The campaign which ensued, culminating at Gettysburg, is generally accepted as the turning point of Confederate fortunes. I think it may be held that each summer campaign in Virginia marked a Confederate crisis. That is to say, that defeat in any one of them would have been followed by the collapse of its government within less than another 12 months, while a victory would assure it only of that much of life. More than that was impossible as long as the war spirit ruled the North, and this was certainly the case in 1863. A year later, however, there did come a period of very great federal discouragement due to a succession of severe losses. At the same time, there occurred a crisis in the military situation, which threatened an ignominious termination to Grant's campaign, the greatest campaign of the war. This was saved by a brilliant piece of federal strategy, which is to be told of in due course. In it will be found the real crisis, the story of the passing of the last hope of Confederate success. It was not lost upon any field of battle, either of offence or of defence. It was a victory of strategy, and not one of arms. It was now for Lee to take the offensive, a role appealing strongly to his disposition. The defensive was to invite the enemy to accumulate his resources to the point at which their very weight would crush us. But, for a brief period, we enjoyed a choice of the field of action. It was a fatal mistake that in this choice we failed to utilize the single advantage in the game of war which the Confederacy enjoyed. We occupied the interior lines, and could reinforce from one flank to the other across our country more quickly than the enemy could discover, and follow our movements by roundabout routes. Only by such transfers of her armies could the South ever hope to face her adversaries with superior, or even with equal, numbers, by demanding double duty of her regiments, fighting battles with them alternately in the East and in the West. In Lee we had a leader of phenomenal ability, could this policy have been once adopted under his direction. Here, in May 1863, was presented a rare opportunity to inaugurate what might be called an army on wheels within the Confederate lines, as distinguished from an army of invasion beyond them. The situation was this. Grant was investing Vicksburg with 60,000 men, and we were threatened with the loss of the Mississippi River and of 30,000 men at Vicksburg under Pemberton. At Jackson Miss, Johnston, with scarcely 24,000 men, was looking on and begging vainly for reinforcements. At Murfreesboro, Bragg, with about 45,000 Confederates, confronted Rosecrans with about 84,000. Neither felt strong enough for the aggressive, and the whole spring and summer passed idly. At Knoxville were about 5,000 Confederates under Buckner, and there were also scattered brigades in southwest VAR and eastern NC, from which reinforcements might be drawn. In this state of affairs, Longstreet, with Hood's and Pickett's divisions, arrived in Petersburg, under orders to rejoin Lee at Fredericksburg. Hooker had just been driven across the Rappahannock, and his army was soon to lose largely from the expiration of terms of service of many regiments. Nothing aggressive was probable from him for many weeks. Longstreet's veteran divisions, about 13,000 strong, could have been placed on the cars at Petersburg and hurried out to Bragg via Lynchburg and Knoxville. Johnston's 25,000 from Jackson and Buckner's 5,000 from Knoxville could have met them. With these accessions, and with Lee in command, Rosecrans might have been defeated and an advance made into Kai, threatening Louisville and Cincinnati. If anything could have caused Grant's recall from Vicksburg, it would have been this. Surely the chances of success were greater and of disaster less than those involved in our crossing the bridgeless Potomac into the heart of the enemy's country, where ammunition and supplies must come by wagons from Staunton, nearly 200 miles, over roads exposed to raids of the enemy from either the east or the west. In this position, a drawn battle, or even a victory, would still leave us compelled soon to find our way back across the Potomac. Longstreet tells of his having suggested to Secretary Seddon such a campaign against Rosecrans, and he also suggested it to Lee on his arrival at Fredericksburg. Mr. Seddon thought Grant could not be drawn from Vicksburg even by a Confederate advance upon the Ohio River. To this, Longstreet answered that Grant was a soldier and must obey orders if popular alarm forced the government to recall him. At that time, Davis was sanguine of foreign intervention, and the Emperor Napoleon was permitting a French firm to build some formidable ironclads for the Confederate Navy. These might have accomplished some results, had not the issue of the Gettysburg campaign induced the Emperor to withdraw his consent to their delivery. Lee recognized the strong features of the proposed strategy and took a day or two to consider it. But he finally decided upon an invasion of Parr. He was averse to leaving Var himself, and also to any division of his army. Both he and Jackson, ever since the failure of the Min campaign, had longed to try it once more, and Jackson had prepared during the winter and spring the remarkable map already mentioned, Paw 322, covering the whole scene of the coming campaign. In the discussion with Longstreet, it was assumed that the strategy of the campaign should be such as would force the enemy to attack our army in position. Jackson had once said, and it was ever afterward an article of our steadfast faith and confidence, "We sometimes fail to drive the enemy from position, but they always fail to drive us." Lee fully appreciated the over-anxiety of the enemy for the safety of Washington, and proposed, for this occasion, a special feature, which he hoped would play upon and exaggerate these fears. 2 of Pickett's 5 brigades had been temporarily left, Jenkins's at Petersburg and Corse's at Hanover Junction. Lee proposed that when his column of invasion crossed the Potomac, these 2 brigades, reinforced by whatever could be drawn from Lower Virginia and the Carolinas, should form a column commanded by Beauregard, who should come from Charleston for the purpose. This column, with some parade of its intention, should advance from Culpeper and threaten Washington. Hooker's army would have been drawn by Lee north of the Potomac. The prestige of Beauregard's name would doubtless exaggerate the numbers in his command, and Lee hoped that the sudden danger might lead the enemy to call troops from the west, particularly if his army could win a battle north of the Potomac. The weak feature was that Lee did not have under his own control the troops which he desired to move. Davis had indeed proposed to him to control all troops on the Atlantic slope, but Lee insisted even on being relieved of the department south of the James under D.H. Hill. He did not take the war debt into his confidence at first, hoping to accomplish his purpose by gradual suggestion and request. The process was too slow, and the result was unfortunate. Only on June 23rd, from Berryville, Var, did he fully explain to the President his wishes. On the 25th, from Williamsport, he followed the matter up with 2 letters, urging the organization of an army, even in effigy, under Beauregard, at Culpeper C.H. Meanwhile, some demonstrations by the enemy from the York River had excited apprehensions at Richmond, and neither Corse's or Jenkins's brigades were sent forward, as had been planned. A reply was dispatched on June 29th, saying, "This is the first intimation the President has had that such a plan was ever in contemplation, and taking all things into consideration, he cannot see how it can by any possibility be carried into effect." Explaining the difficulty of protecting the railroads near Richmond, the letter even suggested that Lee spare some of his own force to better protect his own communications. this caution was not excessive. The messenger carrying this letter to Lee was captured on July 2nd by a raid upon our rear, and, its importance being recognised, it was hurried to Meade and delivered to him on the field of Gettysburg at 4:10 a.m. on July 4th. At that hour there was some uncertainty in the Union councils as to their best policy. The facts given in the captured letter of the difficulties of the Confederates and the impossibility of Lee's receiving any reinforcements doubtless increased Meade's confidence in all his later movements. The letter was considered of such importance that the officer who brought it, Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, was complimented and promoted. In May, our army was reorganized into 3 corps, each comprising 3 divisions of infantry, generally of 4 brigades each, and 5 battalions of artillery, averaging 16 guns each. Ewell succeeded Jackson in command of the 2D Corps, and A.P. Hill took command of the new 3D Corps. He had been an excellent division commander and done conspicuous fighting and marching in the previous campaigns. It has already been said that Stuart would have made a more active and efficient corps commander than Ewell. The figures given are the returns of the officers and men present for duty on May 31st. No later return was made before the battle. Similarly, for the Federal Army, the table below gives the officers and men present for duty on June 30th, the last return before the battle. To arrive at the forces actually engaged, deductions must be made from these figures in both armies for sick, guards, and details. This deduction Livermore averages at 7% for infantry and artillery, and 15% for cavalry. The Confederate infantry by this time were about 9/10 armed with the rifled musket, muzzle loading, mostly of caliber .58, but some of caliber .54. Their artillery was now also all organised into battalions, usually of 4-gun batteries each. Each corps had 5 of these battalions. One of these served with each of the 3 divisions, and the remaining 2 constituted a corps reserve, under command of the senior artillery officer, who began to be called and to act as Chief of Artillery of the Corps. The General Artillery Reserve, which had been commanded by Pendleton, was broken up on the organisation of the 3D Corps, and it was never re-established. Pendleton, however, was retained as Chief of Artillery. It is worthy of note that this artillery organisation of a few batteries with each division, and a reserve with each corps, but with no general reserve for the army, was the first of the kind ever adopted by any foreign army, and that it was subsequently copied by Prussia and Austria after 1866, and by France after 1870, and later by England. But although our reserve under Pendleton had never found the opportunity to render much service, its being discontinued was due to our poverty of guns, not to dissatisfaction with the system. And the fine service at Gettysburg by the Federal Reserve of 110 guns, under Hunt, would seem to demonstrate the advantage of such an organisation in every large army. On Wednesday, June 3rd, Lee began the delicate operation of manoeuvring Hooker out of his position behind the Rappahannock by a movement of the 1st and 2nd Corps toward Culpeper. Hood and McLaws marched on the 3D, Rhodes on the 4th, and Early and Johnson on the 5th. Longstreet's reserve, the Washington artillery with 8 guns, and my own with 26, marched on the 3d. On the 5th, the enemy, having discovered that something was on foot, crossed a small force over the Rappahannock, at the old position near the mouth of Deep Run. On this, Lee ordered Ewell's corps to halt and await developments. But on the 6th he became satisfied that nothing serious was intended, and Ewell was ordered to proceed. In the afternoon, Lee himself left Fredericksburg for Culpeper. Hill's corps now stood alone in front of Hooker's entire army. Meanwhile, Hooker had sent Buford's and Gregg's divisions of cavalry, supported by Russell's and Ames's brigades of infantry, to attack Stuart's camps near the Rappahannock. A severe cavalry battle resulted on the 9th near Brandy Station. The enemy's attack was a surprise, and the isolated Confederate brigades, first encountered, were so roughly handled that help was called for from the infantry and artillery. My own battalion and an infantry force were sent to the field, but reached it too late. The enemy, having obtained the information which was the object of his expedition, withdrew across the Rappahannock under cover of his infantry brigades, with loss of 3 guns and 907 men. Stuart's loss was 485. On June 10th, Ewell's corps left Culpeper for the valley. Rhodes moved to Berryville, while Early and Johnson advanced upon Winchester, and, on the 13th and 14th, drove Milroy's forces into the city. Preparations were made to storm the fortified line at dawn on the 15th, an enterprise which might easily have been disastrous had they been well defended. But Milroy saw his communications threatened and did not wait for the attack. About dawn, his retreating forces were struck in the flank near Stevenson's depot by Stuart's and the Stonewall Brigade, and were routed with the loss of about 2,400 men and 23 guns. Rhodes's division, going by Berryville, had driven the enemy from that point on the 13th, and on the 14th had captured Martinsburg late in the afternoon, taking 5 guns and many stores. Most of the enemy escaped under cover of darkness, though the pursuit was pushed until late at night. On the 15th, starting at 10 a.m., Rhodes reached Williamsport at dark and at once crossed 3 brigades and 3 batteries over the Potomac. The marches made by Ewell's whole corps in this swoop upon Milroy and the fruits of victory secured compare well with the work of the same corps under Jackson 13 months before. Early and Johnson, advancing upon Winchester, made 70 miles in 3 days. Rhodes speaks of his march to Williamsport as the most trying march we had yet had, most trying because of the intense heat, the character of the road, stony and dusty, and the increased number of barefooted men in the command. He goes on to say, "It was not until this day that the troops began to exhibit unmistakable signs of exhaustion, and that stragglers could be found in the line of march, and even then none but absolutely worn-out men fell out of the line. The whole march from Culpeper to Williamsport, which was an extremely rapid one, was executed in a manner highly creditable to the officers and men of the division. A halt at Williamsport was absolutely necessary from the condition of the feet of the unshod men. Very many of these gallant fellows were still marching in ranks with feet bruised, bleeding, and swollen. Of the fruits gathered by the victory, Lee reports, more than 4,000 prisoners, about 30 pieces of artillery, 250 wagons, 400 horses, 20 ambulances, and a lot of ammunition, etc. Besides these captures of military material, large quantities of cattle, provisions, and supplies of all kinds useful to the army were now to be collected in the fertile farming country into which the army had penetrated. Stringent orders were issued, forbidding the taking of private property except by duly authorized officers, giving formal receipts in all cases, that the owners might have no difficulty in establishing claims and receiving payment at fair prices. On June 13th, as Ewell's corps approached Winchester, Longstreet being at Culpeper, and Hill still opposite Fredericksburg, Hooker put his army in motion from Falmouth for Manassas. Before Lee began his movement, Hooker had anticipated it, and had proposed in that event to cross the Rappahannock and interpose between Lee's flanks. It was, doubtless, his proper move, and would have forced Lee to recall Longstreet and Ewell and have broken up his campaign. But it had been decided, soon after the Battle of Chancellorsville, in a council between Mr. Lincoln, Halleck, and Stanton, that Hooker should never again be entrusted with the conduct of a battle. He could not be at once removed on account of the support of politicians who desired to have Secretary Chase succeed Mr. Lincoln as president. His party, with the active aid of Chase, had placed Hooker in his position by turning the scale in his favor, when the choice was between Hooker and Meade as successor to Burnside. They still supported Hooker strongly, and a deadlock was only averted by Chase's friends consenting to a change of the commander in case Hooker should voluntarily resign. The secret of Chase's interest lay in the fact that Hooker had pledged himself not to become a candidate for the presidency should he win a great victory. Meanwhile, as he was not to be allowed to fight, both Halleck and Lincoln refused his sensible proposition to cross the Rappahannock, and Lincoln wrote him the oft-quoted advice, not to be entangled on the river, like an ox jumped half over a fence, and liable to be torn by dogs front and rear, without a fair chance to gore one way or kick another. Now that Lee's army was stretched out over a line more than 100 miles long, even Lincoln saw that a wonderful opportunity was flaunted in the face of the Federals. He now wrote to Hooker in quite a different spirit. If the head of Lee's army is at Martinsburg, and the tail of it on the plank road between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the animal must be very slim somewhere. Could you not break him? Hooker would have only been too glad to try, but Stanton and Halleck were on guard over him, and practically the Army of the Potomac was bound hand and foot, and Lee was free to work his own will, unmolested, until Hooker should be forced to tender his resignation. Hooker's movement toward Manassas was at once followed by Hill's marching for Culpeper on the 14th, and, on the 15th, Longstreet marched from Culpeper to take position east of the Blue Ridge, while Hill passed in his rear and crossed the mountains to Winchester via Front Royal. When Hill was safely in the valley, Longstreet also entered through Ashby's and Snicker's gaps, and about the 20th the two corps were united. The cavalry had acted as a screen in front of Longstreet during this advance, and, in this duty, had severe encounters with the enemy at Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, losing in them over 500 in killed, wounded, and missing. About June 22nd, as Hill and Longstreet drew near the Potomac ready to cross, Stuart made to Lee a very unwise proposition, which Lee more unwisely entertained. It was destined to have an unfortunate influence on the campaign. Stuart thus refers to the matter in his official report. I submitted to the commanding general the plan of leaving a brigade or so in my present front, passing through Hopewell or some other gap in the Bull Run Mountains, attain the enemy's rear, passing between his main body and Washington, and cross into Mind, joining our army north of the Potomac. The commanding general wrote authorizing this move, if I thought it practicable, and also what instructions should be given the two brigades left in front of the enemy. He also notified me that one column would move via Gettysburg and the other via Carlisle, toward the Susquehanna, and directed me, after crossing, to proceed with all dispatch to join the right, Early, of the army in Parr. In view of the issues at stake, and of the fact that already he had been deprived of two promised brigades, Corse's and Jenkins's, it was unwise even to contemplate sending 3 brigades of cavalry upon such distant service. When one compares the small beneficial results of raids, even when successful, with the risks here involved, it is hard to understand how Lee could have given his consent. Hooker's Chancellorsville campaign had been lost by the absence of his cavalry, and Lee's Gettysburg campaign was similarly compromised. Lee, however, acquiesced, only attaching the condition that Longstreet could spare the cavalry from his front, and approved the adventure. Longstreet, thus suddenly called on to decide the question, seems not to have appreciated its importance, for he decided it on the imaginary ground that the passage of the Potomac by our rear would, in a measure, disclose our plans. Accordingly, about midnight of June 24th, Stuart, with Hampton's, W.H.F. Lee's, and Fitzlee's brigades, 6 guns and some ambulances, marched from Salem for the Potomac River. Making a circuit by Brentsville, Wolf Run Shoals, Fairfax C.H., and Drainsville, he crossed the Potomac at Rouser's Ford at midnight of the 27th, about 80 miles by the route travelled. The ford was barely passable. The water came on the saddles of the horses and entirely submerged the artillery carriages. These were emptied and the ammunition carried across by hand. Here the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was cut. Next morning at Rockville, a train of wagons 8 miles long was captured, and 400 prisoners were taken and paroled. In saving a large number of wagons instead of burning them, and in delaying 12 hours to parole his prisoners, instead of bringing along the officers and letting the men go, Stuart committed fatal blunders. The federal authorities refused to recognize the paroles, though they were given at the earnest solicitation of the captured officers, and all the paroled were at once returned to duty. The delay caused to subsequent marches by the long wagon train and the embarrassment of protecting it, was responsible for the loss of time which made, on the whole, a sad failure of the expedition. On the 29th, the Baltimore and Ohio RR was crossed and torn up at Hood's Mills. At Westminster about 5 p.m., a squadron of Federal cavalry was routed, and the head of the column bivouacked that night midway between Westminster and Littletown. Had it here followed the direct road, via Littletown to Gettysburg, only about 16 miles away, it could have occupied Gettysburg before 11 a.m. on the 30th, where it would have found itself in good position in front of Lee's army, then concentrating at Cashtown. It might, however, have had a severe fight with Buford's 2 brigades of cavalry, which arrived in the afternoon, just in time to anticipate Pettigrew's brigade of Heth's division, which had been directed to visit Gettysburg in quest of shoes. This incident will be referred to again. It is mentioned here only to show how near Stuart's expedition came to a happy issue on June 30th. Had it done so, Lee's army would have occupied some strong position between Cashtown and Gettysburg, and the onus of attack would have been upon the Federals, as had been the plan of the campaign. But his orders led Stuart toward the Susquehanna, so he proceeded north to Hanover, which was reached at 10 a.m. on the 30th. Here he had a sharp skirmish with Kilpatrick's cavalry. Hampered by his 125 captured wagons, he turned squarely to the right, and making a detour by Jefferson, he reached Dover on the morning of July 1st, crossing during the night the road on which Early's division had marched on the 30th from York to Heidlersburg. Here he learned that Early had gone toward Shippensburg. Stuart was practically lost and had to guess in which direction he should go to find Lee's army. Lee was now beginning the Battle of Gettysburg, 25 miles off to the southwest. Stuart's report says, "After as little rest as was compatible with the exhausted condition of the command, I pushed on for Carlisle, 25 miles to the northwest, where I hoped to find a portion of our army." He arrived before Carlisle in the afternoon. His rations were now entirely exhausted. He desired to levy a contribution, but learned that a considerable force of militia was ambushed in the town, with a view to entrap him on his entrance. He invested the town, threw in some shells, and burned the United States cavalry barracks. The whereabouts of our army, he says, was still a mystery, but during the night I received a dispatch from Lee that the army was at Gettysburg, about 30 miles south, and had been engaged this day. The investment was abandoned, and the column headed for Gettysburg, where it arrived that afternoon, just in time to thwart a movement of the enemy's cavalry upon our rear. The expedition had occupied 8 days, and had traversed in that time about 250 miles. Meanwhile, Lee had been exceedingly impatient. When Stuart at last reported in person, late in the afternoon of the 2nd, although Lee said only, "Well, General, you are here at last," his manner implied rebuke, and it was so understood by Stuart. He, however, is scarcely to be blamed for suggesting the raid. Had he wasted no time paroling prisoners and saving wagons, his raid might have been successful, as raids go, for his whole casualties were but 89 killed, wounded, and missing. But the venture was a strategic mistake, for it resulted in the battles being one of chance collision, with the Confederates taking the offensive, whereas the plan of the campaign had been to fight a defensive battle. Hill crossed the Potomac at Shepherdstown on June 23rd, and Longstreet began crossing at Williamsport on the 24th. Hooker was not far behind, for he crossed at Edwards Ferry on the 25th and 26th, and moved to the vicinity of Frederick. Here he threatened Lee's rear through the South Mountain passes if he moved north and at the same time covered Washington. Hooker had meanwhile been placed in command of the troops at Washington, some 26,000 men, and at Harper's Ferry, where there were about 11,000. It was a wise order, but under the policy of not allowing Hooker to fight, it was but a sham, as he soon discovered. He attempted to draw 15,000 men from the Washington lines, as his whole army was now in front of the city, but Halleck refused to allow it. He then proposed to throw a strong force across the mountains upon Lee's rear, and, for this purpose, he ordered the 11,000 under French at Harper's Ferry to unite with the 12th Corps, which was to lead the movement. Again, Halleck interposed. He refused the troops on the absurd ground that Maryland Heights have always been regarded as an important point to be held by us, and much labour and expense has been incurred in fortifying them. Hooker appealed in vain to Stanton and Lincoln, pointing out the folly of holding so large a force idle. Then Hooker realized that he had lost the support of the government and tendered his resignation June 27th. It was just what Stanton and Halleck had been seeking, and was no sooner received than accepted, and prompt measures adopted to relieve him, lest the armies should come into collision with Hooker still in command. Meade succeeded Hooker. He was an excellent fighter, but too lacking in audacity for a good commanding general. He was also of cross and quarrelsome disposition, and unpopular with his leading officers. Duplicate orders, relieving Hooker and installing Meade, were sent that afternoon by Hardee, Stanton's chief of staff. He delivered the order to Meade about midnight, while Hooker was still in ignorance how his proffered resignation was being received. Meade protested and begged to be excused in favour of Reynolds, who was the favourite of the army. But he was compelled to accompany Hardee on a ride to Hooker's quarters, some miles away, to deliver the order superseding him. Hooker had hoped for a different outcome. He acquiesced gracefully, but the scene was a painful one,